Good morning and welcome to Rising. Happy Monday morning. We have another great show for you today. Lots of news to discuss with tariffs. I think we're going to be spending a lot of time on that and some other subjects. Nice to see you, Niall.
Good to see you too, Robbie. A plethora of topics on this rather wet and windy Washington morning.
Yes, gloomy, positively gloomy.
But you're going to bring some light to the situation, Robbie, no doubt. What is on your radar?
I shall try. Well, over the past several weeks, President Donald Trump has laid siege to Columbia University, canceling $400 million in federal grants to the elite school. Now, in exchange for the restoration of funds, Columbia's administration has agreed to capitulate to a list of demands relating to the anti-Israel demonstrations that occurred on campus. The university will ban protesters from concealing their identities with face masks, create new disciplinary bureaucracies to punish purportedly disruptive students, and even police the Middle Eastern Studies Department for alleged anti-Semitism. Now, in my view, it's not inherently wrong for the federal government to examine its priorities and decide that an extremely wealthy private institution of higher education with an endowment of $14.8 billion is perhaps an unsympathetic recipient of public funds. However, let's be real. The Trump administration is not focusing on Columbia because it wants to refund the taxpayers. It's clearly punishing the university for failing to prevent the protests. And that is a problem. I'm not afraid to admit it. I like a lot of the things Trump does. Other things I don't like so much. This is one of those things. And look, while some of the protesters at Columbia illegally occupied buildings, prevented other students from attending classes, otherwise impeded legitimate school functions in violation of campus policy, the heavy-handed measures imposed on the university will almost certainly lead to a crackdown on free speech. Some anti-Israel protesters are already facing severe sanctions and even deportation. There is no question that the threat of loss of funding will compel Columbia's administrators to police anti-Israel expression in a manner that is careless and inconsistent with the campus's stated commitment to abiding by the First Amendment. To the extent that the Trump administration's actions have motivated this change in policy, they are drawing criticism from defenders of free speech. Jonathan Zimmerman, a historian of education at the University of Pennsylvania, told The Guardian that Trump's attack on Columbia is already having a chilling effect, and he's never seen anything like it before. Quote, historically, there is no precedent for this. The government is using the money as a cudgel to micromanage a university. Zimmerman's concerns about free speech are well-founded, as I've said, but he is flatly incorrect to state that this has never happened before. On the contrary, Trump is notably following the exact precedent set by his two predecessors, Presidents Joe Biden and Barack Obama, whose education departments engaged in precisely the same government-directed suppressions of civil liberties on college campuses. Democratic administrations did not merely use, quote, money as a cudgel to micromanage a university. They used money as a cudgel to micromanage every university in the country. Let me explain. Now, this was done beginning in 2011 under the auspices of Title IX. That's the federal statute that prohibits sex and gender-based discrimination in education. Under Obama, the Education Department's Office for Civil Rights, OCR, reinterpreted Title IX to require all universities that receive public funding to police sexual misconduct on campuses in a manner that violated both due process and free speech principles. These requirements were panned by organizations that work to defend such principles, including the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. FIRE's president, Greg Lukianoff, accused the federal government of forcing universities to investigate harassment claims even when a reasonable person would not have found the speech objectionable, thereby weaponizing the sensitivities of the least speech-tolerant students of campus. Indeed, the policies forced on campuses by the Education Department were shockingly illiberal. Administrators were told to take swift action against any unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, which in practice meant students and professors faced disciplinary measures for speaking out on such subjects. Now, one of the most iconic, well-publicized instance of this Title IX-driven censorship was the persecution of Northwestern University professor Laura Kipnis, who wrote an essay in 2015 in defense of a colleague who'd been accused of violating Title IX. Kipnis decried the atmosphere of paranoia that had taken hold at Northwestern. In response, she was herself accused of violating Title IX and subjected to a Kafkaesque disciplinary proceeding. She wasn't even informed of the charges against her until she agreed to sit down with the investigators who were flown in from out of state. She wasn't allowed to have an attorney present. That's a mockery of justice, and it's what the government effectively told Northwestern to do. Here's Kipnis describing her ordeal a few years ago.
This emanates from the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights, and all campuses that get any kind of federal funding have to stay in compliance with Title IX regulations, which are very vague, or they risk losing federal funding. So of course, Northwestern is in the position, if anybody files a complaint, to jump into gear and pursue this investigation. So that's kind of what happened. And yes, I was allowed to have a faculty support person, not a lawyer.
And that was the first time to even hear what the case was against you at that moment, and that's the moment that you also had to respond to it?
The procedures are, also baffling, and I don't know if they're like written down somewhere. I found them out as I went along. Like I said, can I have a lawyer? No, you can't have a lawyer. They wanted me to show up to a meeting and they would tell me the charges. They wouldn't put the charges in writing. So they wanted me to show up so they would tell me the charges in person and then have me respond to questions.
No lawyers, no written charges. If Trump forced these policies on universities, I think I know what the media would be talking about. To restate, these farcical persecutions, as described by Kipnis, were done at the behest of the Obama administration in accordance with a strained legal view that federal non-discrimination law already obligated universities to police sex-related speech. When Trump came to power in 2016, his education department rescinded this guidance to the universities. Then 4 years later, the Biden administration largely restored it. The potential loss of federal funding is exactly what motivated virtually every college and university in the country that ran afoul of OCR to fall in line and police students and professors in a manner that violated their free speech and due process rights. Importantly, there were virtually no university presidents who stood up to the Obama and Biden administrations in the face of these threats. No elite campus behaved bravely. Not a single member of the Ivy League decided at the administrative level to fight back. In a recent Facebook post reflecting on what happened, Laura Kipnis wrote this: "People may have forgotten that the Obama and Biden administrations also weaponized federal research funding by threatening to withhold funds from institutions they deemed to be out of compliance with their mandates. Universities were bending over for federal funds long before Trump, spending untold billions to stay on the right side of the OCR bureaucracy." Now, the Trump administration is using anti-Semitic discrimination as a pretext to police speech on campuses, whereas the previous Democratic administrations used gender-based discrimination as their pretext. It's the same bad playbook, and it's engendering the same bad reaction from the universities, which is total surrender.
Well, Robbie, as you might expect, I disagree with some of that. I think there are two separate issues. One is the Title IX provisions that were made during the Obama administration and later reinforced by Biden about the treatment of sexual harassment or sexual violence or allegations thereof. And then there's a separate issue about whether that was, in your words, the exact same precedent here. And we can certainly talk about the first one, and I think it's an interesting topic, but I don't think it's the same thing as is happening here for two reasons. One is, in relation to those Title IX provisions, the money was never directly taken away at any point that Title IX has existed from the universities. Trump, in this instance, rocks up with this demand about $400 million from Columbia, pressures them in that way almost instantly. The second thing that I think is very important to differentiate the two is that the Trump administration explicitly is going after actual teaching within the universities. It was calling for certain departments to be placed into receivership. Columbia basically conceded the point, just avoiding the word receivership, but is having these reviews of its Middle Eastern departments and other departments. To me, that is an administration getting its fingers into information, scholarship, teaching in a way that was not the case in relation to the Title IX issues you're talking about.
I don't agree. I think the Title IX issues did involve exactly what was being taught in classrooms, maybe in a more indirect way than this is the case, because the Trump administration has prompted Columbia to respond, where they're reevaluating the department. But I spoke with, I'm so passionate about this because this was a major area of reporting and research for me back before I was a TV commentator. And I spoke to professors. Again, when I say no one stood up or said anything, I mean at the administrative level. Professors were outraged. I interviewed very left, far left, zany left in my view, professors at Harvard who are like, this is insane. We're afraid to teach anything. I talked to law professors who said, we are afraid to teach the law as it relates to sexual assault, adjudication in class, because we're afraid that if someone is triggered, traumatized by this topic, we will be the subject of a Title IX complaint. We are going to step back from even teaching would-be attorneys how to handle this topic. That'd be like medical school, not teaching how to perform surgery because somebody's afraid of the sight of blood. It really was going to be a backward step for progress. Again, this is not crazy conservatives saying this. This was law professors. The Title IX guidance went so far. And you're right that they didn't actually take any of the funding, but that was the very explicit threat to do so, and why every single university. I thought to write this because I saw what Laura Kipnis had said recently, and I've seen people wonder, why is no one standing up to the Trump administration? No one stood up to any administration that has ever threatened to do just this.
I think that there were obvious excesses in that policy, and in fact, I was reading one of your articles early this morning, Robbie, and you linked to a genuinely interesting and kind of shocking case in Colorado State University in Pueblo.
Oh, I remember this one.
And this is, I'm just summarizing your own
for
work.
our viewers, yes.
But this is an instance where a student athlete and a female trainer had a consensual relationship which she, the trainer, always said was consensual and no harm came to her. And a third party reported it as an instance of sexual harassment or inappropriate behavior.
Yes.
And it went forward, and the student or the athlete was suspended for some years.
Yes.
Eventually, now, I'm not going to defend that. That seems a ludicrous situation. I do think that the broader point here is that one of those issues in Title IX was the evidentiary requirements, right, where it became a preponderance of evidence was all that was required, rather than clear and convincing evidence. That's obviously an issue.
Absolutely. All right, well, we've got lots more to get to today on Rising. We are going to talk about Trump's tariffs, which getting him into hot water, perhaps that he will be able to get out of or won't be able to get out of. We're going to discuss at great length coming up next. Stay with us. Whether you agree with President Trump's tariff strategy or not, there's no question the world is in panic mode right now.
Trump announced sweeping tariffs on practically every country in the world last week, ranging from 10% to 50%. And now global markets are reacting. Tokyo's Nikkei 225 index, for instance, closed at a 7.8% drop Monday, according to the AP. Germany's DAX index opened at a 10% drop, but gained some ground in morning trading and landed at 5.8% down. Paris's CAC 40 dropped 5.8% as well.
As for American markets, the S&P opened at 4,900, the Dow Jones opened at just under 38,000, and the NASDAQ opened at about 15,000, all down.
Here's the President Air Force One last night.
Is there a Trump put, though? Is there pain in the market at some point you're unwilling to tolerate this idea of a Trump put? Is there a threshold?
I think your question is so stupid. I think it's I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
Over the weekend, Trump played in a tournament at his golf course in Jupiter, Florida. The White House sent a statement via the press pool that reads, "The president won his second round matchup of the Senior Club Championship today in Jupiter, Florida, and advances to the championship round tomorrow." Unsurprisingly, that sparked criticism from members of the media. Journalist Chuck Todd, formerly of NBC, called the statement astonishingly tone-deaf.
The president did say on Air Force One that he was open to talking to other nations about potential deals. Here was Trump's team defending his moves.
The president needs to reset global trade. Everybody has a trade surplus, and we have a trade deficit. We are paying away our future and our lives. The countries of the world are ripping us off.
Hey, look, here's the thing. This is not a negotiation. This is a national emergency based on a trade deficit that's gotten out of control because of cheating.
Listen, we've got 50 countries that are burning the phone lines into the White House up, and probably the president's cell phone as well, and probably Howard Lutnick's as well. And I've heard from some as well. This is the ultimate deal maker who is a businessman at the head of our government, finally.
Even some of Trump's supporters are speaking out against his moves, however. Businessman Bill Ackman wrote in part on X, "Business is a confidence game. The president is losing the confidence of business leaders around the globe. The consequences for our country and the millions of our citizens who have supported the president, in particular low-income consumers who are already under a huge amount of economic stress, are going to be severely negative. This is not what we voted for."
Tech titan Elon Musk also weighed in over the weekend and advocated for a zero tariff situation between the U.S. and the European Union. So, lots of chaos in the markets, not appreciating what's going on very much. Look, I too am not for the tariffs, so there's not much of a debate for, I think, you and I to have on this exact subject. I think the best defense for the tariffs, if I'm trying to muster one, is as a negotiating tactic indeed to get other nations to get rid of their tariffs. I agree with Elon Musk. I agree with what these people are saying. And if it's true that other nations are calling in to say that let's make a strategy to both lower our tariffs down to zero, that's fantastic. Now, some people in the administration, I think, clearly have that view that we should not have tariffs, and maybe strategically it's about negotiation. Clearly, other people in the administration have the view that the tariffs are good. They're going to be part of bringing back industry and manufacturing to America, and well, thus then they would have to remain in place. They would have to be very heavy-handed for a long time, and that's not good. So I think there needs, and there's no consistency from the administration on which of these two is the actual reality. I think this debate is still taking place within the administration, with the anti-tariff people trying to say it's a temporary negotiating tactic in order to get to zero tariffs. The other side wanting them to be permanent. I'm not sure who's going to win.
I think that is a more generous view of the Trump administration than I would take, because to me, this is a basic issue of economic competence. There has been, just Thursday and Friday, according to the Wall Street Journal, $6.6 trillion wiped off the value of US stocks. There is about half the country that is invested in the stock market in some way. Those people are in immediate, genuine pain, financial disadvantage. That means they are less likely to spend their money. This is an economy that runs predominantly on consumer spending. In addition to that, there are just real questions about the president's level of economic literacy. Like on Air Force One last night, he said, "Oh, deficits are a loss as far as I'm concerned, trade deficits." Trade deficits are not necessarily a loss. It can be, particularly in the case of poorer countries, the United States has the money to buy things that it does not itself indigenously produce. Diamonds, for example, in the case of Lesotho, where there's only a very small capacity to do that in the US. And people in Lesotho, where the average median wage is about $230 a month, don't have the money to buy American imports by and large. A deficit in that respect is not a loss of any kind. So you have Trump plowing ahead with this policy that is pretty disastrous for the markets, and I think that will trickle through to the broader economy. And just fundamentally making a mess of things, crashing the markets.
Yeah, look, I agree with you on that. Some of what I'm hearing is not solid economics. Yeah, we can have I have a trade deficit with Starbucks, in that I buy coffee from them and they don't buy coffee from me because they produce coffee. If that's what we're getting to, that's just comparative advantage, which is a good thing, even from very basic. And this is standard, by the way, classically liberal or conservative or right-leaning Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell and all those people who will say that trade is good, even if one country produces everything better than another country, it is still beneficial to have for both. Both will be made better off through trade. I've been playing a lot of Settlers of Catan lately. It's a board game that actually illustrates the benefits of trade really well. There's only like 5 resources you can have: grain, sheep, bricks, etc. And you trade, and if no one trades the whole game, the game you take a lot longer to develop your civilization. Now it's a game, so whoever gets, unlike real life, whoever gets to the point of peak civilization first wins, but everybody else's civilizations come along faster too. If you don't trade, the game takes longer. Also, if some third-party government force came in and said, no, in order to make this trade, you have to have an extra sheep produced and we confiscate that every time, that would also slow down the game. It's a nice little indication of why this is bad. But, however, I'm happy to hear stories like the leader of Vietnam and other countries say, let's negotiate this tariff down to zero. Let's have zero tariffs. That's what we want, right? That's what liberals who are now suddenly saying tariffs are the worst thing ever. I'm a little bit taken aback. I agree. I'm wholly against them, have always been against them. It's funny to see hypocrites like the Heritage Foundation, wipe out all of its website pages that say tariffs are bad and replace it with Hail Trump, God King forever. Yeah. But isn't there something about liberal or progressive people have been for using tariffs? I've disagreed with them. Elizabeth Warren was commenting on this, and she's basically saying, well, the way he's doing it is bad because she doesn't like Trump, but it can be good. I'm like, well, what?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that Elizabeth Warren's argument is that there is sometimes an argument for narrowly tailored tariffs to achieve specific goals. In this case, the average tariff levied by the United States has suddenly sprung up globally from about 2.5% to 20-something%. And to your point about your board game, I mean, the whole issue is exactly that. These poorer countries that Trump is complaining about having a deficit with, if you impose tariffs on them, you condemn them to continued poverty, which means they don't have the money yet to buy American imports by and large. So the whole thing becomes a circular argument. And I do find, and I'm not alluding to you here, I'm talking about other people on cable news who are defending Trump from a conservative perspective. And if Joe Biden or Barack Obama had done something where there was such a clear cause and effect, they announced this policy, the bottom falls out of the stock market. These guys would be, up Pennsylvania Avenue with their pitchforks. And now they're saying, well, this is actually, Janine Pirro saying, I don't care about my 401k. Okay, that's fine, but a lot of Americans do, and they're being hurt by Trump's policy.
Right, which is why I have serious disagreements with people on the right, including my dear friend and former co-host of the show, Batya Ungar-Sargon, who's very in favor of them. Maybe we'll get her on maybe soon to discuss it further. And her whole thing is about making the economy serve the working people in better ways. I don't think making things more expensive for things people are going to buy, making that more expensive is going to be good for working people, which is why I hope they pull back from this course of action, particularly with countries. Again, it could be a different thing if you say China is a national security problem and we need to have some kind of policy so that the vital industries for national security purposes can be done in friendlier territory, if not the U.S. itself. That would be a very different policy that I think you would find almost universal support for on the right, and you'd even get a lot of Democratic and progressive support, rather than tariffs for Penguin Island.
Exactly. No tariffs on penguins.
The penguins rising up.
Exactly.
All right. Tell us what you think about this subject. Up next, the fallout from the DOJ's admission that they mistakenly deported a Maryland man to a prison in El Salvador. We'll discuss. Stay with us.
The fallout is growing from the Department of Justice's admission that it mistakenly deported a Maryland man to a prison in El Salvador. A federal judge in a scathing decision is lambasting the deportation, calling it wholly lawless.
U.S. District Judge Paula Zinnes says the administration had no legal grounds to arrest, detain, and deport Salvadoran national Kilmar Abrego Garcia from the United States to a prison in his home country.
Judge Zinnes is ordering the United States to return Abrego Garcia, writing in her 22-page decision, neither the United States nor El Salvador have told anyone why he was returned to the very country to which he cannot return, or why he is detained at CICOT. She added, that silence is telling, as defendants acknowledge, that's the Department of Justice, they had no legal authority to arrest him, no justification to detain him, and no grounds to send him to El Salvador, let alone deliver him into one of the most dangerous prisons in the Western Hemisphere.
Meanwhile, the Department of Justice has placed one of its senior immigration lawyers on leave who had criticized the Trump administration over mistakenly deporting Abrego Garcia. Attorney General Pam Bondi said in a statement, at my direction, every Department of Justice attorney is required to zealously advocate on behalf of the United States. Any attorney who fails to abide by this direction will face consequences. So look, I'm not sure we've tackled this issue yet, you and I. I agree that it was an error. The administration has admitted that they were not supposed to deport him to El Salvador. They could have deported him anywhere else but not there, so they should not have done that, and they should take steps to remedy that mistake, and so they should. Now, I think the media's framing of this story from the get-go was a little bit misleading, of focusing on, oh, a father, oh, this or that. I can't say for certain that he is a member of the gang MS-13, but the judge that initially handled this matter years ago was certainly convinced of that by the evidence, and I think that was a little bit buried in the headlines. So it would be, and people have the view, I think most people in the country have the view, that members of MS-13 should be deported. Now, this person specifically should not have been deported to El Salvador, so that's fine. They should undo that. I agree with them undoing that. I am for due process, certainly. This person had due process at the time period years ago that they determined that he was in fact a member of MS-13.
Well, hold on. He had due process in the process of a protective order being put around him in 2019 by that judge who argued that were he to be returned to El Salvador, he would be in peril of being killed by a rival gang,
Right.
Barrio 18. So that is, the due process protected his presence in the United States and protected him from being returned to El Salvador. And that is something that the Trump administration has, whether by accident or design, just run ramshackle over. That's a problem.
It is a problem, I agree with you, but doesn't that argument then thus concede that he is or was a member of this violent criminal gang, that he's going to face violence from a rival gang? He is then, in fact, in a gang. It's nice that he's been an upstanding citizen so far and a father, but most of the American people want all members of this gang deported, do they?
Well,
not?
I don't know. The issue is that he and his family were at risk from this Barrio 18 gang. I assume that Barrio 18, like any gang, doesn't only target people in rival gangs. I believe that Mr. Garcia's lawyer's argument is that his family were targeted for extortion by Barrio 18, and that he and his brother were threatened with death as a means of leverage to get money from them.
Sure, and the attorney's perspective is perfectly valid to consider, although his job is to advocate, obviously, on behalf of his client. I read the initial court filing, and the evidence was that both an informant who the court deemed credible and to have a past history of correctly identifying members of MS-13 had said that he was a member of MS-13, and also the clothes that he was wearing was this particular, I can't remember, it was a sports gear, not for the city they were in, is a identifier of that gang. The judge said in their decision that they wouldn't have the clothing on just that basis wouldn't have been enough, but in additionally the informant, it was solid enough to make that determination.
But that doesn't get around the bigger point, Robbie, which is that by a legal order, a judge found that this man should be enabled to stay in the United States and not be sent to El Salvador because he would be under threat of his life.
But he shouldn't be sent to El Salvador. They said he could be deported anywhere else, just not to El Salvador.
But he's been deported to El Salvador.
Right, and that was a mistake, and they should rectify it.
Right.
But he does not have to remain in the country, and the Trump administration is undertaking an effort to deport people who are part of this gang, and there is a clear. I mean, it seems clear cut to me that they should not deport him, yes, to El Salvador.
Right.
But I'm not shedding tears for him being deported.
I don't understand how it's not clear cut to you that the wrong is that he's been sent to El Salvador.
Yes.
That's the wrong. That is the thing that the judge found couldn't be done.
Yes.
And the Trump administration has now done that. And when this other judge who we mentioned, Judge Zinnes, says bring him back, the Trump administration says, yeah, sorry, we can't really do that. Like, that is obviously, to use the judge's phrase, lawless on its face. Then you have the other point that we mentioned in our introduction, which is this lawyer suspended from the Department of Justice, apparently for giving basically truthful answers in a previous hearing when the judge said, look, they didn't really have authority to deport this guy to El Salvador, did they? And the Department of Justice lawyer said, no. And that's like not really disputed by anyone, but because he's not buying into a fictitious line that this was in fact justified in some way, the guy is being suspended for stating facts, which should be part of a lawyer's job.
Yeah, I don't have any support for that. The administration has admitted this was an error, and I agree that they should work to correct it. They should get him out of that prison and then deport him somewhere else.
But that's what they say they're not going to do. That's the point. The point is the administration has been told, you made a mistake, this guy shouldn't be in El Salvador, that's in contravention of a court ruling, bring him back. And they're essentially saying, no. That's lawless action by the government.
Well, they're saying they don't have the ability to get him back because he's in a prison that's not in this country anymore that they don't have jurisdiction over.
Yeah, but I mean, that's their bestie down there,
well,
the El
okay, so then
Salvadorian president, who
they should apply
they're
diplomatic pressure to return a gang leader to the United States so that he can be deported somewhere else.
I think that they should comply with the law.
Well, I agree. They made a mistake, but he's not subject to our jurisdiction anymore. He's not in our country.
They made a mistake.
They removed a gang leader,
that they're
a gang
no
member.
effort to remedy.
They removed a gang member from our country
Alleged.
to the wrong place. Well, I mean, it's not alleged though. It's part of the initial court decision.
It's alleged.
We can magically believe that maybe he was innocent, and maybe he was. I don't know, but evidence was presented, and the court case from 5 years ago, the judge determined that he was in fact a member of this gang.
The judge determined that he shouldn't be deported to El Salvador, which is what we keep coming back to. And the
shouldn't have been deported to El Salvador.
It doesn't really matter what the law says, we'll deport who we like. It's a fundamentally lawless
They didn't say that, though. They said we made a mistake deporting him to El Salvador, but there's nothing we can do about it now because he's in a prison in a different country. And they should fix that. I agree with you, but I would save my outrage for an American citizen or a person who wasn't actually in a gang or something like that.
Well, I would save my outrage for a presidential administration that disregards the law.
All right. Tell us what you think. Up next, the anti-Trump protest that swept the nation this weekend. We will discuss.
Millions across the US took to the streets this weekend, unleashing a fury of protests to make their voices heard loud and clear. And they were ripping into President Donald Trump and his sidekick, Elon Musk, telling them to keep their hands off the United States.
Over 1,200 demonstrations were planned by more than 150 groups across all 50 states, civil rights organizations, labor unions, LGBTQ advocates, pro-Palestine activists. They all rallied together to sound off on the Trump administration. Marks the first major opposition protest since Trump did take office.
Protesters assailed a laundry list of the Trump administration's moves, including its firing of thousands of federal workers, its closing of Social Security Administration field offices, its deportation of immigrants, and its scaling back protections for transgender people.
The White House released a statement on the protests applauding the president while ripping into Democrats, writing, "President Trump's position is clear. He will always protect Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for eligible beneficiaries. Meanwhile, the Democrat stance is giving Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare benefits to illegal aliens, which will bankrupt these programs and crush American seniors."
So, was the president listening to the people? Well, it's hard to know because he was off golfing at his club in Jupiter, Florida the entire weekend. But Elon Musk did take to X to denounce the protests, reposting numerous posts that were assailing the demonstrations and saying, "The problem is the puppet masters," oh, the evil puppet masters, "not the puppets, as the latter have no idea why they are even there." I'm enjoying today's show, Robbie, I must say. We have been assailing President Trump for his terrible tariffs and his unlawful actions on deportations, and now here we are talking about the revitalization of the resistance.
Yes, I saw a little bit of the protest. Were you out there with a sign? With your...
I was not out there with my sign, but I was observing this rise of dissent from Mr. Trump.
I think the protests were incredibly cringe, very boomer, very okay boomer. It's a bunch of old hippie people with signs that aren't even that funny. Look, I have a lot of disdain for protesters just in general, so you'll not...
I thought you'd be a Tea Party guy back in the day, no?
Oh, yeah.
There you go.
Taxed enough already.
Yeah.
No, honestly, I always find protests a bit cringe, even if they're protests that I happen to agree with. I obviously don't agree with these protests. It is interesting that it's taken some time for actual protests to arise. There was very little protesting on election morning when Trump was elected the first time. The protests were immediate across the country. There was a swiftness to the energy, to the vibe, to the resistance. Now it's taken this long, and it's almost more directed at Elon Musk than it is against Donald Trump for various reasons. But yeah, you never really want mass protesting against you, so it's not a good thing. But I don't think, we're such a polarized country. I think the Trump coalition knows that, yeah, there's a lot of people in this country that don't like them and don't like what they're doing, and we just count that there's slightly more of us who do, and so this is not going to prompt any revisiting of the course of action, I don't think.
So a couple of things on the Elon Musk element. We have talked before about his unpopularity. He's less popular and more divisive than Trump. He's very unpopular with independent voters, voters in the middle ground, and female voters. I mention him not only because of that fact, but because that tweet that we read out about the puppet masters, does anyone really believe, there it is again, does anyone really believe that nonsense, that it's the puppet masters who are getting these people out into the streets? You are quite right to point out that there is legitimate opposition to the Trump administration. I think that has grown more fervent, perhaps, partly because of Elon Musk's actions relating to Doge, partly some of the other things we've mentioned on today's show. So you don't need puppet masters to draw people out into the street. That obviously does not deny the fact that there's a very large number of people who think Trump is great and what he's doing is great and are very enthused by him. And if Kamala Harris were president, those people would quite feasibly be out in the street protesting her actions.
It is the case that there's genuine opposition to Elon Musk and Donald Trump manifested through these protests. It's also the case that resistance, to the extent there's an organized resistance, it is well supported and well funded by wealthy progressive backers. That's also true when you have right-wing protests, the Tea Party movement you mentioned the other day. I remember, being a part of that and hearing progressives decry it as AstroTurf and it's the Koch brothers paying for it. And yes, there were powerful conservative people funding parts of it, and also there was genuine outrage and opposition to what the Obama administration was doing. So I just kind of consider this par for the course, that it is very typical for people on both political spectrums to try to portray the protesting on the other side as organized by some shadowy cabal, when the reality is that there is both. There is a cabal of some sorts, and also there is genuine outrage and anger at not people literally being paid to protest.
I mean, I think cabal gets back to the whole puppet master thing, which I don't think it is whatsoever. I think people
a different word, a
are
group. I'm not saying it's illegitimate. I think the effort to try to get money out of politics is a little bit impossible to do and infringes on certain First Amendment principles. So no, let George Soros have his fun, spend as much as he wants, and Koch brothers spend as much as they want, and that's all fine by me. It's not illegitimate to me.
I think the vast majority of street protests are organic. But before we sort of close up this segment, I don't want to miss out on a bigger point here, I think, which is that I am highly skeptical that Trump's win last November, clear though it was in the Electoral College, bespeaks some massive electoral realignment, because we already see in the opinion polls that changing, where his approval ratings are now underwater in at least 3 reputable recent polls. Obviously, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race that Elon put so much money into was almost indistinguishable in its outcome from the previous one a few years before. This is a very narrowly divided country. That's why people are out protesting Donald Trump. I think that there are many reasons why they are doing that, and many valid reasons why they're doing that, and we'll see how it goes, particularly if his tariffs stay on.
If your point is just that Republicans should not rest on their laurels, it will be, yes, the midterms will be competitive, the next presidential race will be competitive. The next presidential race, despite liberal fears to the contrary, will not involve Donald Trump being on the ballot. The coalition he's assembled has not yet, and this is a concern I know that top Republicans have, has not yet necessarily figured out a way to win when Trump himself is not on the ballot. He is the movement, and so Republicans are going to have to deal with that. Yeah, I don't think while we're kind of enduring a media vibe shift to the right and a shift away from like woke excesses and some of those things that made Democrats particularly unpopular. If Democrats agree to shift away from those things, it will then make them more popular and more competitive. Well, and you will see competitive elections, certainly.
Right, and we've also seen anti-insurgent swings for quite a long time now in American politics, where it moves quite radically from one side to the other, and then there's the pendulum swings.
Incumbency used to be an advantage. I think it is now probably narrowly a disadvantage. So we will see what happens.
Well, I agree on that point at least.
Coming up on Rising, ever heard of kakistocracy? Don't worry, we will break down this term with special guest Richard Hanania. Stay tuned. Aristocracy, oligarchy, tyranny. You might be familiar with these terms, but have you ever heard of kakistocracy? It is when government is formed or led by the least suitable or competent citizens of a state. I can see where this is going.
In a recent Substack piece, author Richard Hanania argues kakistocracy is taking shape right here in the US and populism is to blame. Joining us now to explain is Richard himself. He is president of the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. Welcome.
Great to be here.
So talk us through the elevator pitch as to why we're lapsing into kakistocracy.
So around the world, we're seeing an uptick in populists coming to power, and populism is defined in various ways among academics and people who study this stuff, but there's not a lot of disagreement about who populists are. I mean, Trump is a populist, Milei is a populist, Bukele is a populist, Orban is a populist. We basically agree on who the populist leaders are. They're distinguished by a us versus them mentality. They're distinguished particularly by rallying against elites. They tend to be opposed by institutions like mainstream media, academics, journalists, nonprofits, basically established players in their society. And everywhere across the world, we basically see a common pattern. These experiments do not work out well. We have a lot of data on economic growth. Populists are bad for the economy. This is true for right-wing populists. It's true for left-wing populists. Left-wing populists tend to be a little bit worse, but they're all, it's all part of the same package. So you see institutional decline. You see a lot of pseudoscience. You see a lot of corruption in government. And these things kind of seem unrelated, but really they're kind of, I argue, they're the product of the same phenomenon. What you're seeing is basically people who are appealing to ignorance. They're basically telling people to reject trusted sources of information, and God knows they do have problems. I mean, the media, the educational establishment, we've all been through that. But a kind of politics that just starts with a rejection and negation of that tends to lead into very bad places. And I think we've seen that. I think we've seen a particularly vivid form of this in the second Trump administration. The first Trump administration, he surrounded himself with people who could be considered the establishment, people who had risen to high levels in the military. Mike Pence was his vice president. A lot of establishment Republicans were in the administration, people like Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. And the first Trump administration worked out pretty well. I think we've been moving towards a place where we're letting Trump be Trump, and that means Trump having the kind of personnel who are going to be loyal to Trump and do what he wants and not really challenge him. And I think we've seen the results in this tariff debacle over the last week.
Yeah, you and I and Niall are probably not very far apart on the tariff issue itself. Probably got to find a guest to bring on who's going to defend them. I guess let's push back on the populism being bad part of this. Up until before the tariffs, I'm watching what Trump is doing. Trump has all of the business leaders on his side, the wealthiest, most productive heads of the tech sector. Elon Musk, obviously, in a very visceral and flashy way, a big Trump supporter, but also people like Zuckerberg coming aboard, Jeff Bezos being more supportive, heads of Google, heads of Apple, etc. Is it really, can we say it's a populist administration, even if the wealthy industry saw up until this point Trump as the avatar of, it must have been deregulation and favorable tax policies, and then the actual project of shutting down, in my view, in a healthy and beneficial way, lots of government agencies, mass firings of government employees, an effort to actually shrink government that Republicans have been promising for decades and never delivered. That all, if you call that populism, then I guess I am a populist, but I identify as a libertarian. I don't like to get overly hung up on what word we use to describe various things. Can there not be a marriage of these concepts, I guess, at least up until now, where a free trade is very much a wedge issue between a more tech libertarianism and a national populism?
Yeah, so I mean, we do, I think, have to get a little bit into the definitions of populism just for the sake of the argument, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, some people will define populism as, look, you have to be economically redistributionist, you have to have like a kind of political views of Bernie Sanders or something like that. That's generally not how we use populism, either in the academic literature or in kind of journalism and how people talk about these things on a daily basis. Javier Milei is not a guy who's into economic redistribution. He's not into bashing the rich or anything like that, but he's generally considered a populist. Populism is usually defined by being just anti-establishment, just appealing directly to the people against an establishment. And you could have free market principles with that. You could have socialist principles, whatever. I mean, the interesting thing is it tends to work out poorly. It's this kind of style and this like essence of politics tends to have a lot of bad results. And so, I mean, as far as the business leaders bending the knee to Trump, I think that this reflects something that I argued when we were all talking about woke capital, which is that business is really kind of, they submit to power. I mean, they submitted to power during George Floyd, all the, when wokeness seemed like a juggernaut and they were all giving in and it seemed like they would be pushed around by the media and activist organizations. And, as soon as that turned on a dime, Trump started taking steps against DEI, made clear that he was going to try to reward his friends and punish his enemies. A lot of these guys kind of bent the knee, and not every case is like this. I mean, Elon Musk seems like more of a genuine convert to MAGA or Trumpism or whatever. But I would say Doge kind of reflects the populist style in that its claims are false. I mean, they're still claiming, I've seen them still claim $4 billion a day. They claim they're going to get rid of $1 trillion from the budget. The specifics they've argued for as far as the programs they cut, when New York Times or the Wall Street Journal goes and fact checks that, they turn out not to be true. They turn out to be off by orders of magnitude, or just these contracts were already canceled or whatever. And so I do think that this kind of reflects the problem with populism. These aren't wonky people. I mean, Musk, as intelligent as he might be, as much as he might have accomplished in business, doesn't seem to have a kind of intellectual interest in how government works, or think they're talking to the serious people who've been thinking about the ways to shrink government. And we've seen that in Doge. I mean, maybe it's accomplishing some good things, but it massively overpromised. It wasn't, I think, a good way it could have been a good way for Trump to use his political capital, which is fast dissipating, but it ended up not being. And I think that's another cautionary tale of going about this in a populist way.
And to that point, Richard, I mean, that links to something you were saying a few minutes ago that I wanted to pick up on, because it seems to me that a lot of people have written in recent years about the sort of fall of authority and of the idea of expertise, which is increasingly questioned. And of course, it is fine for anybody to be questioned. But sometimes, to the point that we're talking about, that seems to me to flip, particularly in populist circles, to just an assumption that the expert opinion, however that is defined, is wrong, and therefore some inexpert opinion is correct. But in fact, if you follow down that road, you do get something like Doge making all these false claims, or firing people working on nuclear safety and having to hire them back again, or you get someone like RFK Jr. as health secretary and kids dying of measles, or of course you get the President of the United States imposing massive sweeping tariffs and $6.5 trillion being knocked off the value of the stock market in 2 days. So there are real dangers, aren't there, in excessive skepticism of the experts just leading to policies that are basically stupid.
Yeah, people who are more sympathetic towards populism, they do this thing where they can read off a list of things that the establishment got wrong. Oh, they told us there's no way COVID came from a lab. They told us, we should close down the school for years. They told us that the Hunter laptop was Russian misinformation. You see these things all the time. And they never count the things that the establishment has been right about. I mean, you can't just go through and make a list of where people have been wrong. Things like vaccines, the establishment has been correct. They said tariffs were bad. We're proving that right now. In Sri Lanka, in 2019, they elected a president who was against pesticides and wanted to convert the country to organic farming, caused a huge hunger crisis, economic catastrophe. Nobody remembers that. The populists don't understand that basically on things like GMOs and the best way to farm, the establishment gets that right. I mean, they get right nuclear safety. We don't have nuclear meltdowns in the places where we have nuclear power, and so it's fine to sit there and say they got X, Y, and Z wrong, and maybe this particular expert or this particular field we shouldn't be listening to. Those arguments are absolutely fine. The problem is where you just think that you could just listen to podcasts, not read serious journalism, not pay attention to what experts and scientists are saying, and just Google things on your own and listen to kind of these cranks, and you could have an accurate view of the world. I think that is clearly not the way to go.
I think a healthy dose of skepticism and questioning of authorities and experts is good, but I agree with you that just neither automatically rejecting expertise or automatically accepting it is a good policy for a balanced world. Richard Hanania, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up, Anthony Fauci, speaking of experts, had some words of wisdom. We'll talk about that coming up next.
It's been a little over 5 years since the initial COVID lockdowns, and while many are looking to put the pandemic behind them, some health experts are looking ahead to the next pandemic.
What is likely to happen, I don't know if it's going to be next year or 10 years or 15 or 20 years from now, is the emergence of another respiratory disease. It may be another coronavirus, because we know that coronaviruses really, mostly in bats, have the capability of binding to receptors that are in humans. It could be another flu.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, speaking at the New Orleans Book Festival late last month, said he's concerned over the spread of illnesses like bird flu and the cuts being made to the dozens of agencies and offices under the purview of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the Department of Health and Human Services.
We're dealing with H5N1 now, which is bird flu, which has taken the somewhat disturbing step of infecting mammals, namely cows and cats and other mammals, which means it's adapting itself more to a human. So my concern, Walter, is that whenever that happens, the next outbreak will be of a respiratory disease that's easily transmissible, that has a significant degree of morbidity.
And we are making this a little bit more dangerous with the cuts and our attitude toward science?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're removing the pandemic preparedness and response programs that we put in place, 5 or 6 years ago.
Fauci has received a lot of his criticism over his role in the coronavirus response, especially lockdowns. He's been accused of working to censor dissenting voices during the height of the pandemic. And my major criticism, Niall, that I'm going to get into here is we have to be prepared for the next pandemic. How about this? How about we don't cause the next pandemic by doing the exact kind of research he is discussing and has been the chief proponent of doing, including during the Obama administration, when Obama ordered a halt to such research. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is the opinion of the FBI, the Energy Department, and the CIA independently, for various reasons that I wish we could see publicly and know more of, that the most plausible origins for COVID is a lab experiment gone wrong in China, doing research with members of a research team that Fauci's people were funding and interacting with. And so that's why I don't want to hear from them, we're doing too much cuts. It's our distrust of science is what's going to cause another pandemic. The distrust of science is the scientists causing the pandemic in the first place. So I think that is healthy and appropriate skepticism, and a lot of this needs to be reviewed and totally shut down so that we don't have another situation where we kill millions and millions and millions of people because they did experiments on bats in unsafe conditions.
Would you shut down, to be clear, all form of gain-of-function research?
I would do like Barack Obama, I would call for a total shutdown of all gain-of-function research. And then this is what Rand Paul supports. I've talked to him about it. He said, shut it down, and then we can come up with a committee that will review if in some very special circumstance, if it should still be done, and then do that. It should not be done in China under conditions we can't manage. Maybe you can do it safely in some in some Arctic facility somewhere, or in Greenland, the 51st state, whatever. It cannot be done by China under conditions we can't control. Is that fair enough?
No, I mean,
is that that wild an idea?
I don't think that it is that wild an idea. And I mean, obviously the gain of function stuff and the dissembling around exactly what went on is a bad thing. I mean, I'm not here to defend that. I just think that what Fauci said there seems uncontroversial to me. I mean, I get that Fauci, by his nature, draws this kind of Pavlovian response from a lot of people, and that people start sort of foaming at the mouth as soon as he appears. But what he actually said was simply that it is good to prepare for the next pandemic, good to trust science, good to resource science. And the point about what is censorship and what is disagreement. One of the things that I think we were both looking at in terms of research and on X about this was someone saying, him talking about censorship, this was disproved by a particular email. This person, to their credit, posted the email, and it was actually Francis Collins wanting pushback on a particular thing, the Great Barrington Declaration. That is not, censorship is not disagreement, and disagreement is not censorship. And so there was, I think, an eliding of the distinctions there.
Well, that's not even chiefly what I'm mad at him about.
No, I understand that.
The sense, that is not a great example of him contributing to a climate of, I wouldn't say censorship, of chilling. I think in other ways he was responsible for that. In that specific email, yes, it is fine for him to say to other government scientists, we disagree with this, and let's respond. Yeah, let's push back on it. That was not an example of them saying, let's have it delegitimized or taken down. Now, it is the case, if Fauci is not directly, specifically responsible for this, that suppression of dissident COVID topics on social media was done at the urging of the CDC. I have seen those emails. Fauci was not the head of the CDC, so there are other people you can more directly lay the blame for that. But frankly, while I'm militantly against censorship, even if Fauci was engaged in more censorship of COVID, that would pale in comparison to his other crimes, in my view, which is a direct level of responsibility for, if it can be I mean, he's, I'm not saying shoot the man without a trial or something, but it is very plausible at this point that the research that he was the main backer of, and the person who agreed to exceptions, who signed off on this. I've read the deposition where he admits that during the period of the pause, he tries to kind of evade. Well, I don't quite recall. I don't quite remember that he was the one, or his deputy, signing off on, you can still do this research even though Barack Obama has ordered a halt to it. That now looks very likely to have been the causal event for millions of people dying worldwide. And that's why I found the pardoning of him so appalling, that we would take off the table a responsibility. And then there's the irony of that we put that man in charge of the response, in charge of advising the government on how to respond to a mass death event that he may very well be significantly responsible for. Obviously, it's not his fault that he is not the one doing the bad experiments and that they leaked from, but it is a kind of reckless negligence that resulted in, and that people were warning about all the time. There were people all along saying, in mainstream media, I read a New York Times piece from one of these doctors years ago saying the pause is a good idea because, man, this stuff is dangerous and deadly. Ralph Barrick now says he thought it was bad all the time. Maybe they're trying to make themselves look better from having been complicit, but it sure looks to me like he just went way ahead, got out on a limb on some really dangerous research that...
Well, I mean, I think the reason that he was in the position he was in at the outset of the pandemic was that he was probably the preeminent national expert on viruses and infectious diseases. He had previously done, I think, work that was generally pretty widely heralded on the AIDS epidemic and on actions in the early stages of that. There's all sorts of books that are actually well worth reading about the battles that went on around that era. And so, we were talking earlier on in today's show with Richard Hanania, talking about the dangers of just being reflexively anti-expertise. Yes, I think the gain of function stuff, the Eco Health Alliance stuff, certainly is should be looked at, should be investigated, should be scrutinized. But I also think that when Fauci comes up, there is often just a completely disproportionate or reflexive anger at him that I don't think is justified.
I don't know that it's disproportionate. I mean, the reason I am distrustful, again, I agree with Hanania. People should watch that interview, that you shouldn't just automatically distrust expertise. Experts are right about a lot of things. I have great respect for experts in the fields of like economics and markets, which is why I'm not for the tariffs, for instance. But a lot of what Fauci, the expert, was saying from the beginning, then you can get into the mitigation strategies that he talked about, that 6 feet of social distancing, a sort of made-up guideline. He was against masking, and then he was for masking, and said any mask will do. And then we eventually learned the truth was you really need one of the high-quality masks, or you're not making much of a difference because it's so. In fact, it's fine to be wrong, but there was because science is a collaborative and adaptive process.
And an iterative process as well, right? You
Yes,
come forth with a thesis, and if that thesis proves wrong or flawed, you then adapt it accordingly to the evidence.
It was something, it wasn't just advice, it was like, because then state and local municipalities just implemented whatever the CDC told them, at least in blue states, and early on in red states, and then there was fury. There was a lot of force and coercion in government policy around ideas that were still being debated openly, and you can have a view that they were doing their best and scientists were doing their best. It was a difficult situation, but still a lot of mistakes were made, and maybe I'm just not so forgiving of those.
Yeah, I'm more forgiving. There we are.
Forgiveness. Forgiveness is Niall's middle name, I guess.
Exactly.
What is your middle name? Maybe you don't want to say.
I would say Graham, but you would say Graham in this country, I believe. That's bizarre.
With the H spelling or the A-E-M?
Yeah, not like Graham Parsons.
No. Well, my middle name is a secret, so I won't reveal it. Fair enough. Coming up, former vice presidential candidate Tim Walz had some big words for his own party. We'll see what he had to say. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz seemingly criticized his own party over the weekend. The former VP candidate made an appearance on CNN, was asked a question about the Democrats' election losses back in November. Take a listen.
What do you make of the criticism that one of the reasons why your party was so resoundingly rejected last November is because Democrats were gaslighting the country, saying that inflation was not a big deal, heralding Bidenomics. Not only Biden, but Kamala Harris was heralding Bidenomics, pretending that there wasn't a problem at the border.
I think one of the things that we didn't do is we assumed that we said, and it was true, that we were going to have a soft landing and our economy was better than the rest of the world. Better for who? I go back to this. Don't talk about food insecurity or housing type of issues. Talk about people being hungry and wondering where they're going to live, or about their children's future, about real security. And so I think your question is spot on. I think we got intellectualized on this.
Walz seemed to be arguing that the Democrats' message was too highbrow or possibly too abstract, I guess, to connect with voters. I mean, I think that's part of it, but I don't know if that's the main issue. I mean, the issue was just that people didn't like the state of the economy, and they thought Democratic policies were not going to do enough to address that. I don't think Kamala Harris being complicit, clearly, in Joe Biden's economic policies as his number two, was the big problem, and then she failed to explain what she would have done differently or how it would be different when prompted to do so. There was no, well, I disagree, I respect the president, but he got this one really wrong, and here's what we would do differently. And in fact, if you're trying to look back to the past on how she did differ from Biden when she herself ran for president, it was by being, I would say, more progressive on issues like, for instance, fracking and other things that were not going to, that if implemented would be, in my view, the view of probably a lot of Americans, certainly all conservatives, we're going to be even worse for the country in terms of the economic picture. So it wasn't about being, sometimes Democrats, I think, get overly hung up on, we didn't dumb it down enough for the American people. That's just kind of like insulting. I don't think that's the problem. Furthermore, I am not at all convinced, and it might just be because I don't like him, so take that with a grain of salt, that Tim Walz is some effective communicator or appealing political candidate for the national stage, but maybe you feel differently.
Well, I do feel differently. I was glad when Kamala Harris picked him as her vice president, and I thought that he was effective, and then ended up being kind of constrained and somewhat hidden away during the campaign, and I didn't think that was useful. To your point about the election itself, I agree with a fair amount of that, in the sense of your hypothesis or diagnosis of what's happened, is, I think, underscoring the fact that it wasn't as an election, it wasn't that exceptional, really. People see it as exceptional because it's Trump and he gets elected to a non-consecutive second term. But what you had was a vice president running to succeed an unpopular president who had been afflicted, politically speaking, by the wounds caused by high inflation in particular earlier on in his term. And therefore, Kamala Harris was always fighting an uphill battle. And if that is the case, particularly on the economy, you're always going to be struggling in peacetime elections. Now, as to Walz's point about the language used, I am more generous toward that, or more supportive of what he's saying, I think, than you are, because I do think there is a propensity sometimes for Democrats to speak in the language of academia, or the language of excessive sort of political correctness, if you want to use those terms. James Carville, who we've had on Rising and has been on most shows in most places, talks about this a lot, the idea that it is a usage of certain language like people of color or Latinx that in fact alienates people to some extent, and isn't the way even those groups refer to themselves. And so it's easy then to be cast as sort of in the ivory tower.
Well, certainly. I think it is right for Democrats to learn that lesson. I think they are learning that lesson, that, the real PC language excesses are not helpful to the party for exactly the reasons you're describing. They're alienating to working people. They're alienating to minority groups, don't even like being talked to that way. But the underlying policy matters too. That he was getting into housing insecurity. Sure, yeah, right. Why call it housing insecurity? Just call it not having a place to live, or not being able to. But Kamala Harris's plan for that was some massive subsidy to first-time home buyers, right? She was gonna give money to first-time home buyers. What was that going to? That was going to just raise that was just going to raise housing price. The market will adjust by sellers will charge more to people to buy homes. The problem is the housing supply. We have a housing supply issue, I would argue, because in a lot of cities like DC or places in California, there's too much zoning restrictions around. I think this is an area where right and left can agree that there's too much. It's too difficult to build. The tariffs are going to be bad for this, because we need to buy. We need to get raw materials to build more houses. But also, just where you can build is too limited by government policy. Talk about things like that. That's along the lines of what Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson are talking about in their new book. She had a throw money at it answer that I don't think would have helped anything.
Well, I think that, setting aside the specifics of the housing issue, this is probably one of the sort of fundamental areas in which though we favor in some ways similar outcomes, disagree on the way to get there. Because I think you tend to think of the removal of regulation as being something that works to enable those things. And I think that is seen as a panacea only if you don't consider the inherent inequalities of wealth and power, and if you don't really give full acknowledgement to what I would consider the avariciousness of a lot of those wealthy interests. So, for example, why has the minimum wage not increased in this country for many, many, many years, to the point where even inflation now has rendered it far less valuable than it was the last time it was set at $7.50, I believe, $7.25. That's something that I would, of course, favor lifting up, and I don't think you would.
I absolutely do not.
No.
Well, not at the national level particularly. How could you have, what you can get for your money is just so different depending on what state you're in or if you're in a city. I don't see how you could have one universal rate.
Because the universal rate then is the floor. It is not saying that, if the local authorities in New York wish to have a higher minimum wage, which they do, than the federal minimum wage, then of course they should have the right to do that. But you establish a floor beyond which people do not fall, because it becomes basically rapacious to employ people at such dirt poor wages.
Yeah, that's where we just philosophically disagree. I would use some other welfare mechanism to give money to people who are in poverty. I would not say that it is illegal to work for. my basic ideology is nothing that adults, like transactions between adults that they consent to, can be invalid. If you say, I want you to do, I'm willing to pay you this much money to do this job, and you say you accept that arrangement, then it is no business of mine or the government. So it's just a philosophical issue. So I would not, now, if people don't have enough money to live on, I would address that through universal basic income or more generous welfare or food stamps or something. I wouldn't say that the transaction between us is invalid. That's like, I consent, I don't. I don't see why the ethics of it are any different.
Yeah, where we disagree.
But that's a philosophical issue.
Yeah, exactly. There's a philosophical difference, because I think that the scenario you just outlined ignores the fact that people can be in such straitened, desperate circumstances that they are left with no alternative but to consent to things that are obviously abusive, because they literally have no other option barring, starvation or outright penury.
Next up on Rising Rabble-Rousers or Rising Stars, coming up, we will look at Democratic members turning to maybe new leadership. Cory Booker, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We'll discuss. Stay with us. Well, there's no question that Democrats have been doing some soul-searching since their electoral loss last November.
There's also been no shortage of speculation as to why Democrats performed the way they did.
Which, of course, begs the question, should Democratic leadership change?
At least one viral poll thinks so. A survey by Data for Progress, which is a Liberal firm, had some interesting results. 55% of likely voters said they supported or leaned toward Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in a hypothetical 2028 New York Senate primary. Only 36% said they supported incumbent Senator Chuck Schumer, the current party leader. The margin of error for the poll was plus or minus 4 points. 770 voters were surveyed via text and web panel in late March. Meanwhile, a CNN poll in March also found that Ocasio-Cortez best reflects the Democratic Party's values.
Schumer had been taking heat lately for voting to pass a continuing resolution bill the Republicans supported. Some congressional Democrats, like Congressman Glenn Ivey, who came on Rising to discuss, had expressed disappointment in Schumer for that move. Other liberal groups have also called for Schumer to step down if he wasn't going to take a more aggressive stance. Despite the backlash, Schumer has filed paperwork to run in 2028.
And then there is Senator Cory Booker. Booker broke the record for the longest Senate floor speech in history last week, clocking in at a little over 25 hours. During the speech, Booker railed against President Trump and Elon Musk and their policy initiatives. Here are some highlights.
The Trump administration and Republicans in Congress are right now, they are trying to gut Medicaid and Medicare programs on which nearly a third of our country rely, all to pay for those tax cuts. They're also dismantling the very institutions meant to safeguard our nation's health and well-being. That's why I'm going to stand here and explain to people what's going on and how our health care programs are at risk and being undermined. This is about right or wrong. It is wrong to take away health care from millions of people.
Booker has received praise from his fellow Democrats. Senator John Hickenlooper told The Hill, "We've all been hearing the same drumbeat, do something. He did something for all of us." Senator Chris Murphy also told The Hill he's a leader. He knows he's a leader. What he did puts him in a position to be an even more impactful voice, and that is really, really good for our party.
To be sure, multiple Democrats told The Hill they believed that presidential ambitions didn't motivate Booker's speech. One Democratic senator did tell The Hill, though, it's too early to know if there's long-term momentum here, but clearly it was a good moment. It was a good moment for the caucus at a time when people have been clamoring for action. Rob, are you clamoring for action from the Democratic Senate caucus?
Much action, so clamor. Look, he's fine. We discussed this. He can do this. I don't have any problem with it. I used to like Cory Booker a bit more than most other Democrats, frankly, because he was a bit more to my side of things on education issues. He was a big proponent of school choice back in the Obama days when it was not so unusual for a Democrat to be that way. I think that became a more toxic position given the importance of the teachers' unions, and he became a little bit more dismissive of the policy. But, I like that he was one of the people willing to be slightly more brave in standing up and saying Joe Biden's really old, and so on and so forth. The AOC of it all, I think she very well might primary Schumer. I can absolutely imagine that happening.
Sure.
He's lucky that this is, well, maybe he's not. I would say he's lucky that this is 4 years away, because certainly there's time for the anti-Schumer energy to die down. Of course, there's also time for her to organize and prepare and mount a very serious bid for his seat. Now, maybe the party elite and establishment will just so go after her and try to destroy her for doing that she won't succeed or she'll get talked out of it. I think it's probably an open question whether she does it or not, but she's got to be, tell me if you think I'm wrong, I think she's got to be looking at these numbers and going, I might make a go of it.
Yeah, no, I don't think you are wrong in that respect at all. And to the bigger point, you know, in politics and in political journalism, we all have politicians who we like more or less just because that's how they strike you. I would be more pro AOC than I would be pro Cory Booker. He kind of irks me at times just because going back to this is ancient political history now, but
You've got some pre-existing beef with.
Well, it's not even so much a beef. Well, I first came to the US in 2003, and a couple of years after that, there was a documentary movie made about Cory Booker's first run to be mayor of Newark. It was called Street Fight, and it was Cory Booker fighting as the insurgent candidate against a guy called Sharp James, who was a very old-school Democratic mayor with a kind of penchant for spectacle and also with accusations of corruption. Anyway, I remember watching the documentary.
Corruption in New Jersey.
Who would have thought? And I remember watching the documentary at a time when Cory Booker wasn't that well known, and I was kind of glad that Sharp James beat him in that first race because I just maybe it was the way the documentary makers made it, which was this very sanctimonious. You were going to restore honor and push back against these kind of shady characters, and I just had a bit of a fondness for Sharp James and a bit of an adverse reaction to what I considered the sanctimony of Booker.
Vainglorious.
Yeah, but well, I am Spartacus, lest we forget, was the Senate speech. Do you remember later on Booker made where it was his Spartacus moment, I think.
I totally forgot about that.
In fairly more recent years. Anyway, look, he's entitled to make his 25-hour Senate speech. That was fine. I thought he made some good points. It's not that I'm anti-Cory Booker. I would be more excited about an AOC candidacy for Senate or for anything else because I think she is a very, very she's actually underrated in her political skill, in my opinion, and in the way that she sort of fits the moment because of social media, a certain mode of communication. Yeah, lots of people hate her because lots of people hate her politics and because she's a young woman. Okay, that's fine, but lots of people love her too.
Yeah, I strongly dislike her politics,
Sure you
but
do.
I concede that she is a appealing political figure who does have some amount of crossover appeal, who has people who voted for Trump and voted for her that she's tried to better understand. I think it was crazy not to put her in that leadership position and put Jerry Connolly, who is very old and has serious health problems, instead. Where is he out there in the media making the pitch? I think that was crazy and very emblematic of the Democratic Party's problems. I have no desire to give democratic socialism more say over our government. In fact, I already
join the revolution.
I already think democratic socialism has way too much control over our government, and in fact, some of these policies I'm seeing look exactly like democratic socialism to me, and I would not like to see them continue. But
when we set up the junta, there'll still be a place for you in it, Robbie, somewhere.
No, just shoot me and be done with it. It's fine. I'm ready. I'm ready to go. On this optimistic note, we end our show for the day. Thank you so much for tuning in to Rising, and be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, Nowville, anywhere you can find podcasts. I was just kidding, by the way. I do not want to be killed by the junta. So
good.
I will be here alive to do the show tomorrow. Bye-bye.